Hello, James Carey here of Carey's Almanac, and I've come here to St Nicholas's Church, one of the many thousands of Church of England churches all over the country. It's in the village of Sandford Orcus. Now, I know that sounds like a made-up place, Sandford Orcus. It's on the border of Dorset and Somerset, not far from where I live. And I've come here particularly not because of St Nicholas. We're not going to talk about him, we'll get to him in December when it's St Nicholas's Day. But I've come here because I want to talk about Oak Apple Day, or Royal Oak Day, which was a festival in the Church of England for 200 years that began in 1660 and ran till about 1859, I think. And I'm particularly pleased that when I got here, I discovered that there is a large oak tree right behind me. And so I'm going to go over to that now, and we'll talk about why and what Royal Oak Day is, Oak Apple Day is. What even is an apple? Do oak trees have apples? They have acorns, don't they? I'll tell you in a moment. And then we're going to go to another church via a special route called the Monarchs Way. So do stick around for that. And then there'll be a different tree at the end. I know, it sounds very exciting, doesn't it? But if you're anything like me, you find this sort of stuff fascinating. So stick around, and let's go over to the oak tree now. So what is Royal Oak Day, or Oak Apple Day? It's celebrating the restoration of Charles II, who came riding back into London in 1660 on the 29th of May, which is Oak Apple Day, in triumph. It was also his 30th birthday. That's a red letter day for King Charles II. Suddenly he was welcomed back. The Commonwealth was over. Cromwell had died. It had all kind of come apart, and finally everyone gave up fighting and gave up admitting that we could manage without a king, and the king returned, and he was poised and ready to come back. And to celebrate this, Parliament commanded the Church of England to put into their Book of Common Prayer prayers for the celebration of Royal Oak Day on the 29th of May. Which in 2025, the year I'm recording this video, is also Ascension Day. So that's a bit of a conflict of interest there, but there's normally ways of sorting that out within the Church of England. We don't have to do that anymore because it isn't one of the days, because it was scrapped in 1859. But why is it called Oak Apple Day? Well, we're going to find out why the royal oakness of it. But let me just tell you a bit about oak apples that I didn't know until very recently, because it's only recently I just thought, oh, hang on, they don't have apples. This is mad. Now, apples are a very English fruit, and particularly down here in Somerset, so I didn't really think about it. But then what I discovered was that you can get oak apples, which are large kind of things that gather around the larvae of wasps. And so these things come up that look a little bit like small apples, but they're oak apples. I found some really small ones on this oak tree, and this oak tree must be ancient. The girth is absolutely enormous. But that's what an oak apple is. And so in the 1860s, you would celebrate this day by wearing oak leaves or an oak apple. People might decorate the church with branches of oak trees, and everyone would celebrate and have a great time. Probably involved a lot of heavy drinking, which is one of the reasons why they scrapped it in the 1850s. They felt that had all got completely out of hand. So the reason I've come here, I mean, I could have come to any church with an oak tree in the churchyard, but I've come here because we are on the path of what is called the Monarchs Way. And the Monarchs Way will tell us a little bit about what Charles did before he was crowned king, and where the oak tree actually comes from. So we're going to have a wander down the Monarchs Way, and this part of the Monarchs Way is actually a really special part for reasons I'll tell you in a moment. Shall we go? Okay, so this is where the Monarchs Way can get a bit confusing. But what is the Monarchs Way? Charles II, he wasn't Charles II yet. It's about 1650. His father, Charles I, has been beheaded. He lost the English Civil War. They couldn't find a solution. They executed the king. They set up the Commonwealth, the Protectorate. Cromwell ends up in charge of that. But you've still got Charles I's son, also called Charles, roaming around the place. He's actually crowned King of Scotland, tries to rouse the Scots against the English. Cromwell defeats them at the Battle of Dunbar. This is one of the reasons why Cromwell thought he could do no wrong, that he was God's chosen, because he's just won every single battle. That felt like guidance to him. And then a year to the day later, in Worcester, he defeated English forces in favour of Charles, the son of Charles I, at the Battle of Worcester. And at the end of that battle, what happens? Charles heroically hides. I don't like Charles II very much, you will be able to tell that. Charles II heroically hides in an oak tree. The oak tree isn't still there. There's another one that's grown from the same oak tree, I believe, up near Worcester. He spent the night then in a priest hole, and which is sort of ironic because everyone thought that his father was secretly a papist. And then some say that Charles II himself went to Rome on his deathbed at the end. So some irony there, if that interests you. So after the Battle of Worcester, he hides, he goes on the run, and he's going to try to get out of England altogether. He's not going to go back to Scotland, that's not safe, so he goes south. He walks south, he trots south. There are various adventures and escapades that will probably make quite a good TV show. And he ends up coming all the way down towards the south coast. Except what happens is he passes through here. I don't know how closely the Monarchs Way, which is now a public footpath about 600 miles long, I don't know how closely it maps his exact journey and whether we know that. But what happens is he goes south all the way down to Charmouth on the south coast, and then he can't get a boat from there, he can't get away, too many troops around, it's too dangerous. So he then goes back up north and he comes essentially through here again, which is why there's a Monarchs Way on that side of this river and there's another Monarchs Way on that side of the river. And I think on that side, he's trying again to get away. He goes east and he ends up going out of the country at Shoreham in that year, 1650-51. And he ends up in France, and that's where he stays. He ends up in Paris. And so 10 years later, when the Commonwealth kind of falls to bits, he returns triumphant. Now, I don't think he was triumphant because he lost every single battle, and the king lost all the battles, the key battles in the English Civil War as well, although he won quite a few at the beginning. So anyway, he trots into London, takes hours getting across London Bridge, which is really incredibly narrow and built up on either side, and it's quite a squeeze. But anyway, there are cheering crowds and everyone is relieved that the Commonwealth is over. And so at that moment, Parliament meets and declares it Royal Oak Day or Oak Apple Day. And then in the 1662 Book of Common Prayer, which is the sort of the standard for the Church of England for, well, until essentially the year 2000, maybe 1980s, they start to have more modern liturgies. But it stays in that prayer book that whole time. It's only in 1859, which is almost 1 year short of 200 years, that festival is eventually withdrawn and is no longer a public holiday. It's kind of interesting that this is when factories are starting to kick in. There's industrialisation. Factory owners don't want their workers knocking off for the day. There were also two other festivals that were revoked in 1859. One is the day of Charles the Martyr, so that's Charles I. He's called a martyr, and he is bemoaned and bewailed on the 30th of January, the date of his execution. There are prayers for that. And there's also prayers of thanksgiving for James I's salvation from the gunpowder plot. So that's the 5th of November. Again, there are prayers in the back of the Book of Common Prayer for these things, and collects and special things and celebrations. Because in a way that made England what it was, at least in the 17th and 18th century. But it's interesting to me that they were withdrawn, but the Book of Common Prayer continued for at least another 100 years. So That's why this is the Monarchs Way. The monarch, who was only the King of Scotland at the time, is Charles II, as he would come to be. It was his escape south, and then when he came back, there was much rejoicing. So that's the history bit. We've looked at one oak tree. There's another apparently huge one, really, really old one that probably predates Charles and everybody, over in that direction, which we're going to go and look for. And then there's a second church with a different tree in the churchyard, and then we'll talk a bit about that. So stick around for that. But anyway, let's go back to the Monarchs Way. So there it is. That is the oak tree, and it's funny. It's 6.5 meters in circumference, I think. I mean, it must be at least 400 or 500 years old. Maybe it goes back to the very early apple oak day. I can't find out any specific information. It's not one of the super famous ones. There's a dozen or so really famous ones where we know that they're 800, 900, 1,000 years old. But being that size, it must be pretty ancient. And the funny thing is, I've walked past that tree many times. I come on this walk pretty regularly. It takes us down from Corton Denham, another place that sounds like it's made up, all the way to Rimpton, and that's where we're going to go next. But I guess the thing that I'm just thinking about is how we've got all of these churches around us. We've got all of these trees that have been there for absolutely centuries, and we're now blind to them. They actually really connect us to our past. That is a living organism that's still alive and has been alive for hundreds and hundreds of years. And although we think that we're going to live forever, we sort of don't really feel like we're going to die anytime soon, or at least I don't. These things really do embody immortality in some kind of a way, or just living for a long time. And I guess that's why Tolkien was so drawn to them as well, because if you live for that long, you also end up with a great deal of wisdom, which, as the Bible tells us, is the fear of the Lord. Start there, and everything else kind of follows from that. So there's a tree that Tolkien would have loved, an old oak tree. And here's the other thing I learned. I read a book about oak trees, and I've already forgotten most of it. I need to go back and read it again. But what I've heard is that King William the Conqueror, who did us a bit of a favour, at least with oak trees, when he turned loads of forests into places for hunting, he thinned them out so that they could get their horses in amongst and go looking after wild boar or whatever, and go shooting and hunting. And in that thinning out process, just did a massive favour for all of those trees, particularly the oak trees that don't do well in dense forest. They need a bit more space to spread. So what he did there, William the Conqueror, was literally sow the seeds, as it were, for the British Navy hundreds of years later. I've already talked about how, on another video, the dissolution of the monasteries helped pay for the beginnings of a navy. Well, William the Conqueror created these massive oak trees, so by the time they were making warships in the 17th century, even the 16th century, they had these massive oak trees from which they could build these huge ships with which Britain then ruled the world. So that long story that a tree gives you is just played out in so many different ways, and I just find it utterly fascinating. I hope you do too. There's a bit more about the British and their wood because we're going to go over to the church St Mary's in Rimpton, where we're going to finish this video. So stay tuned. Let's go there now. So I finally made it to St Mary's in the village of Rimpton, and over there's the church, obviously, that's the back of it, and there's a yew tree over there. That's another tree that is really associated particularly with England, and but also with churchyards. Churchyards, now lots of people love to talk about the pagan past and thousands of years ago or hundreds of years ago, before the churches were Then the yew trees were associated with the dead and with the living and with life and pagan temples or whatever, and the churches were built over them. There's really very little evidence for that, and I think people are kind of moving away from that view, although you'll still find a lot of that lurking around on the internet. But actually, the yew tree exists in churchyards for 2 or 3 reasons. One is it grows really well anywhere, and so it's a naturally very healthy tree that also reproduces very easily. So even if it dies, in the rare occasion that it does, it will probably another one will grow up not too far away. The reason I think they were encouraged is also they're kind of poisonous and they keep cattle out of a graveyard, and this is a place where the dead are buried, and you don't want to dishonour them by having mooing cows roaming around the gravestones. And so if you actually eat quite a lot of the yew, it's poisonous. It will do you quite a lot of harm as an adult human, as well as a cow, and cows can put away a fair amount of greenery. So there's that, but also there's a connection with England in particular because of what would happen on a Sunday, and this was a controversial thing that was one of the causes of the English Civil War, we'll talk about that in a moment, is that people would practice their archery on a Sunday, and they would get the longbows out, and for hundreds of years, from like the 13th century onwards, the English were all practicing archery every Sunday, and so that eventually, when the 100 Years came along and they went over to France, their archers were absolutely devastating. So such a simple weapon, the bow. And what is the bow made of? Well, one of the things it can be made of is a yew. So the yew tree is associated with England. It can be made from other things too, but the yew is particularly good. You wouldn't grow yew trees for bows in a churchyard and rip them up, and because you can't get that many bows out of a yew tree. But there's a kind of an interesting parallel and symbolism there, which again, if you have eyes to see them and you look around, then you can see them, and that's what we've got here. So we've had the oak tree and the royal oak for Charles II and his day in 1660, and that's the yew tree, which takes us back to a previous time. There weren't any longbowmen in the English Civil War. By that point, anybody on the battlefield would have a musket, and the reason a musket was so helpful and brilliant, even though it wasn't very accurate, is because it didn't take long to train, and you didn't have to spend essentially your whole life from the age of 6 onwards developing the muscles to be able to draw a bow and all that kind of thing. Give someone a musket and hopefully it doesn't blow them up, and hopefully it does more harm to the enemy than it does to them. But anyway, the rifle came along much later, which was a much better weapon. So that's the story of the yew tree. That's why they're often here in graveyards, and there's one here in St Mary's at Rimpton. But what we're going to do is go around the corner now and just talk a little bit about the Church of England, as I often like to, and the effect of the English Civil War. And what's super interesting to me is how essentially the wrong people were around at the wrong time. But I'll get into that in a second. So we've walked a bit of the Monarchs Way, we've seen a big old oak tree, we've thought about the royal oak, and we've even seen some yew trees, and part of our longbow history. And here we are at another Church of England. We've began at St Nicholas, so here we are at St Mary's. And let's just finish off by thinking a bit about the Church of England, and I talk about this on my blog on Carey's Almanac as part of Royal Oak Day or Oak Apple Day. And the thing I was reflecting on is how I don't like Charles II. I don't like the way he lived. I think he was dissolute. I think he was sexually incontinent. And it saddens me that the nation rallied behind him to be their king. But it also struck me that we don't get to choose who God uses to bring us back together. And there are some other illustrations I'm sure you could think of where this is not the person I would have chosen for the task. But here we go. So there's an irony there. Charles II comes back, and what do we get? We get a Church of England. We get the 1662 Book of Common Prayer, in which there are special prayers to be said for King Charles II. Thank God for this man, even though there's evidence that he converted to Catholicism on his deathbed, and lots of other stories about him and about his mistresses and all that kind of stuff. And then he handed over the throne to his brother, who became a Roman Catholic, and it all was a disaster. But by that stage, the Church of England continued. and it was already safe with its 1662 Book of Common Prayer. It kind of had reoriented itself. And there was that sort of 10 years before that I really want to think about a bit more at some point in the future. What happened in 1650 when the Church of England was essentially abandoned, abolished. The House of Bishops were abolished, and every parish kind of did its own thing for 10 years. I would imagine many of them just carried on exactly as before, and others just kind of wandered away or set up their own little sect or group or independent church. And that was, you know, the Catholics often sort of talk about how Protestantism is fundamentally schismatic, and, you know, they're not wrong about that. Everyone just goes off and does their own thing, but there's also some virtue in that. So you don't want to keep unity at any price, if that price is false teaching. And of course, that's something the Church of England is thinking about at the moment. The other great irony is actually Charles I, the one who brought about this disaster in the Church of England and the nation, was desperate to be unified with the whole kingdom. He wanted united kingdoms, 3 kingdoms together, but he couldn't do it. And his reforms of the Church of England made a bit of a mess of it. And eventually, for example, what you did on a Sunday was a really contentious thing. So the Book of Sports that was introduced by James I, I think, kind of to annoy people and annoy Puritans. He liked doing that. Became a real bone of contention, and Puritans were thinking, why would you do this? Why are you doing this? So they wanted a purified church, they wanted a really Calvinistic church, and others kind of wanted something a bit broader. And it led to the breakup of the nation over that. I think it was a religious war. But anyway, we're going to have future videos about all of that stuff. I'm going to dig much more into that. The war, the English Civil War in the West Country, is fascinating as well, and I've got 1 or 2 bits and pieces I want to cover on that. But anyway, lots more over on the blog on Carey's Almanac. I've been talking about this stuff for a few years over there, so you've got a huge back catalogue of other days in the Christian calendar to look at, and thoughts about the Church of England and all those kind of other things too. So go on and have a look about that. Thanks for watching all the way to the end, and I'll speak to you next time.